Today, I want us to have a discussion on how Europe and America do everything they can systematically to keep Africa poor, to portray a particular idea about the continent outside, not a good notion anyway, a bad one, to, keep pushing this whole, we do not have anything, it is the West that are coming to help us, and we can't develop anything ourselves except we have a connection to Europe and America. I want us to look into it. Now, when we tell you that these people are so shameless that they go to any lengths to do everything in their power, shamelessly, to destroy the image and reputation of the motherland. Some of you think that it's maybe because we are pro-Africa. That is why we are going to go instigate things. Oh, it's not true, it's a lie. Oh, go check your informations very well. Are you sure it's a true news? Are you sure it's true information? Why do you think that a particular notion, a particular information sometimes gets suppressed? You hardly hear of it. And then the one they wanted to hear of it, they push it out to every media. Your attention are focused on that one. When your attention are focused on that one, they are doing the other ones they tell you is a lie behind the scene. This is how we are being deceived by day, and our inheritance are taken from us. A young man was bribed by an NGO, okay? A Western NGO. And obviously, when you do a lot of digging into that NGO, you discover that it has a connection to the government of the world. When we talk about Dangote and the refinery here, we were thinking that it was just the Nigerian government that were against Dangote. Of course, they used the Nigerian government. And when they discovered that it was not going to be easy to turn the Nigerian government against this refinery, they went internationally to go search for someone, a reporter, that they can pay a huge amount of dollars to write an article. And this reporter would not write an article from his own experience or whatever, with his own words. They are going to provide this reporter, or they provided this reporter, you're going to hear from his mouth. They provided this reporter with statement, what he is going to say word to word. It was systematically written, it was drafted, so that the moment this reporter brings this thing out, we will have no other option but to believe that we are the enemy of ourselves, when originally the enemy is Europe and America. The collective West, Your Majesties. This is how they do their thing. This is how they play their game. You know, when I saw this, the joy I had was that we still have African youth who are ready to give up their life to protect the motherland. That was the joy for me. I became emotional because you see where people do anything to go to Europe and America. People can go to any length to, disown their own because they feel that they're going to have a better life outside of the motherland. But to see someone who have the motherland at heart to this point of coming out, he wasn't even thinking about his own safety, because coming out to expose this definitely is in two ways. It's either he succeeds or they take him out. He came out and exposed it all. And I want to leave you with his story, and you leave your thoughts and opinion there at the section. Remember, a lot is going down like this that we are not aware of. For this one to come out, that shows that a lot is going down that we are not aware of. Most of the things that happened, and we think that the problem really is us. Yes, the problem is us. But there are other external forces that are trying their best. And that's what I would say. However the world wants to paint the motherland to you, just know that the world cannot survive without Africa. And the moment Africa rises, every black nation around the world rises with Africa, because we have a connection. We have something in common with each other. Africa fits the world, and the world cannot survive without Africa. The situation that Africa is in today is all thanks to the collective West. Is all thanks to Europe and America, and the puppets that we have within us, the betrayers that we have within us.
And now to Nigeria, where a London-based NGO is mobilizing a media campaign against the country's first local oil refinery. And that's according to investigative journalist David Hundeyin. He said that the NGO, Dialogue Earth, tried to bribe him to write an article discrediting the facility. Now, let's now cross live to that journalist, David Hundeyin. David, it's good to have you join me now. An NGO called Dialogue Earth offered you $500 to write a smear piece against the Dangote refinery. Can you tell us more about this?
It's not uncommon for a journalist like myself in the international space to be contacted by different actors uh, wanting to commission a piece for one reason or the other. The reason this one took my attention was that this was coming off the backdrop of a very high-profile series of news incidents regarding Dangote refinery, and this NGO that reached out in the way they reached out to me kind of made it implicit that they didn't really want this to become public, that they're reaching out to me, but that am I open to doing something? And it just struck me as a weird way of contact of trying to commission a piece, that am I open to this? Because if you're not doing anything shady, you would simply just come and say, hey, I'm so and so from this organization. We want to commission a piece for blah, blah, blah. Are you available? Right. So I said, yeah, sure, I'm open. Send the brief. And they sent the brief. And I instantly understood why the manner of reaching out to me was so shady, because the screenshots from the brief, which I'm sure you've shared with the audience, which I shared earlier this morning, show very clearly that the purpose of this brief was essentially to write a smear piece against what, to all intents and purposes, is going to be a very important piece of economic infrastructure, not just for Nigeria, but for the entire West African coast. Bear in mind that this is a group of about 15 countries which have very little local refining capacity and are almost entirely dependent for their local fuel needs on the output of European refiners. And as a result of that dependence, as I'm sure you remember from the famous Trafigura incident in 2006 in Cote d'Ivoire, European refiners have for a long time been able to get away literally with murder. They've been able to blend toxic waste. They've been able to blend extremely high sulfur fuel content into these cargoes headed for West Africa, because who's going to do anything? It's just Africa, right? This is a refinery that is not only going to change that dynamic by making West Africa less import dependent, but that potentially is also going to disrupt the European uh, refining industry. Because I don't know if you're aware, Dangote refinery is by far the biggest refinery in that region of the world, the Europe, Middle East, and Africa region. It's more than double the size of the next biggest one. So clearly, some people are not going to be happy about that. And it was clear that the purpose of this brief was to use the language of environmental concerns, to use the language of the sort of activism industry to attack the refinery and to lay the sort of narrative groundwork for the very validity or the very economic necessity of this refinery in a governance sense to be questioned, right? That by putting my name on this piece, obviously being that I have quite a high profile in Nigeria, and that by putting my name on this piece, I'm essentially going to be endorsing a sort of astroturfed narrative that could potentially be used to attack the very existence of this refinery. Bear in mind that something like things like this have happened in Nigeria before. For those who may not be aware, Nigeria has or had at one time the world's largest steel mill. It's almost impossible to industrialize without producing steel, right? So the idea behind the steel mill, which was built, I think, in 1979 by Soviet contractors in a place called Ajaokuta in Kogi State in Nigeria, was to give Nigeria local steel processing capacity. And because of chicanery like this, because of things that came out of people's pens, and because of memos that came out of offices, to date, that steel mill has not worked. To date, there was nothing wrong with the steel mill technically. I think it had achieved something like 98% completion before the contractor stopped work. There's actually nothing wrong with it. It was purely political the reason why that stalemate didn't get to work. And I could see that something similar potentially is being set up with this refinery here. This is a refinery that, putting aside whatever concerns that I personally have had about the business practices of the individual or the company behind it, objectively speaking, this is a very important piece of national economic infrastructure. Nigeria is, like many other African countries, suffers from that basic African economic problem of exporting raw materials cheaply and importing expensive finished goods, such that your currency is constantly depreciating because you constantly have a balance of payments and balance of trade deficits constantly by design. This refinery is a piece of economic infrastructure that promises to reverse that trend, bearing in mind that Nigeria's largest single foreign expense is import of fuel, right? So it makes sense for for Dangote refinery from a Nigerian economic point of view to work. So why on earth is this British NGO then trying to commission a prominent Nigerian voice, a local Nigerian voice, to sort of set up a campaign of sort of high level whispers against this refinery? You're talking about how, if you read through the brief, it wasn't left to my discretion to determine how to even write the story. It was sort of laid out in very clear detail. This is how we want you to do this. This is how we want this to be framed. This is who we want you to speak to. This is how we want this to be worded. So essentially, they've basically given me the entire outline of the article, right? And I'm just to sort of flesh it out and put my name on it. So anyone who reads it then thinks that this is David Hundane's high level analysis of the situation. Meanwhile, this is something that came out of some desk in London. So I wanted to know who is actually behind this. And I started doing some digging. And it turns out that Dialogue Earth has received funding from the who's who of what I refer to as the American CSO NGO industry, or known colloquially, have some kind of an interest in preserving the African economic status quo. But here we have hard evidence that these people are actively um, uh, paying for a campaign to essentially keep Africa poor.
All right. Are they, you've given us a perspective to all of this now. Are there more examples about, as you wrote, a resistance campaign against Nigeria's first private local refinery?
Well, so as I said, I would assume that I'm not the only one who was reached out to by this specific NGO. But even zooming out for a second, even the um the difficulty that the refinery is facing in its sort of opening stages of activity also point to some sort of high level gang up to prevent this thing from working, both locally and internationally. Um, so there was a very interesting graphic that I saw on a Bloomberg article a few weeks ago that sort of outlined the sheer difference in size between the Dangote refinery and the next biggest one. I think it's in Rotterdam. I think it's owned by Shell, right? And the Dangote refinery is almost double the size of the next biggest one in the region. And the trouble with this, from a European perspective, is that regardless of where the inputs to this Dangote refinery come from, it can export to pretty much anywhere and everywhere. And by virtue of its sheer size and scale and its relative newness, because it's much newer than all these other ones, so it's also more efficient because the technologies are more up to date. That means that it's going to be more competitive and it's going to be able to offer traders refined fuels at a marginally lower rates. And if you're familiar with how all trading works, those tiny little margins make all of the difference. So essentially, this Nigerian refinery has been recognized as something that is potentially going to upend an entire European industry. And the European refiners clearly are not happy about this. There was an OPEC report which emerged yesterday, which you also may have seen, where it was stated very clearly that not only is Dangote refinery projected to potentially upend the European market, that it has already started upending the European market. That as far back as January this year, when it started um, exporting cargoes of like gas oil and jet fuel, that sort of thing, that these have gone almost exclusively to Europe. And basically, it's the local refiners in Europe who have lost out. So clearly, there is at least circumstantial evidence to point to the idea that, based on the fact that some people's economic interests in Europe are clearly being hurt by the existence and the success of this Nigerian refinery, then some sort of counteracting measures have to be taken. And we have started seeing those counteracting measures. We've seen the sort of campaign of whispers from the end of people like myself, where they've reached out to a journalist. I'm going to assume there are many more. On the local front in Nigeria, we've seen all of a sudden the drama surrounding crude oil supply to Dangote refinery, where all of a sudden um, the the um, the authorities in Nigeria, who, as you may or may not know, are very, very much US aligned. Some will go as far as to describe them as a US puppet administration. All of a sudden, have made this huge song and dance about whether it's possible to actually supply Dangote refinery with feedstock or not. Bear in mind that Nigeria is Africa's largest oil producer. At one point, I think it was the world's eighth largest oil producer, and somehow, with a daily stated official daily production of anything from 1.1 to 1.8 million barrels per day, somehow cannot supply 650,000 barrels per day feedstock required by this refinery to function, right? And instead, we've in fact we've had the local regulators come out and make very incendiary comments directly attacking the refinery. We've seen the head of a local regulator in Nigeria come out a few weeks ago and make comments, public comments, in front of TV cameras and microphones to the effect of the sulfur content in the diesel put out by Dangote Refinery is higher than regulatory limits, and that Dangote Refinery is trying to monopolize the country's energy sector. Which, whether that is true or not, it is incredible that a local regulator would come out and make such a comment about a local business, especially in a space where it's competing against, very well-heeled, very old international oil companies. So that just shows the extent to which there are several entrenched interests, both locally and internationally, which are aligned, which seem to believe that it's not in their interest for this refinery to actually function.
All right. Since you put out this information, what has been the reaction from your colleagues or even the general public since now they're aware how they approached you and the details behind what you were originally commissioned to do?
Well, so the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, thankfully. A few of my colleagues in the media space have actually reached out to tell me that they're proud of me for actually turning this down. And they've made comments to the effect of similar offers, not necessarily from this particular NGO or for this particular purpose, but similar offers geared toward similar outcomes of essentially acting against Nigeria's economic interests, having made to them in the past or having made to people they know in the past. And it's not everyone that had this sort of big picture thinking to turn it down. Because bear in mind that the basic issue here is not necessarily about money or not money. The basic issue is that most people don't even understand that there are huge geopolitical interests and that there's a huge geopolitical chess game going on in the world. Most people in these parts are sort of very focused on like their day-to-day career, the day-to-day survival, and any sort of opportunity to build some pipeline of work or some credibility or some relationship with an international funding entity, they'll jump on it, right? Without thinking about the potential ramifications of what it is that they're doing. So these colleagues have said that they're proud that at least I was able to see what was being done. A few people I know within the NGO CSO space have also reached out to sort of nudge wink that, well, yeah, we know that these things happen and we know that we operate in the same space, and we're not necessarily able to be as bold and forthright as you are, because obviously you don't work in this space and you don't earn a living from this space, but we respect the fact that you're doing it exactly where it is.
All right. Thank you so much, David Hundeyin, investigative journalist. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your insight here.
Thank you for having me.